A Nazi officer collapses in a German-occupied town. No gunshot, no explosion, just silence. When soldiers rush to his body, they find something impossible, a crossbow bolt buried deep in his chest. In the middle of World War II, someone was hunting Nazis with a medieval weapon. The hunter? A soldier whose name was erased from history. But his revenge mission? That changed everything. This is the story of WW2's silent avenger, the Crossbowman. Picture this moment. You're looking through the lens of history, through what appears to be a sniper scope, scanning the battlefield of World War II. You expect to see the usual instruments of modern warfare: tanks rolling across muddy fields, planes screaming through the sky, soldiers clutching their rifles, their faces covered in dirt and fear. But then, the focus shifts, and what you see doesn't make sense. It's a weapon that shouldn't exist in this war, a weapon that belongs to another century entirely. A crossbow, simple, silent, deadly. And in the hands of one man, it became something far more powerful than any gun. When we think of World War II, our minds immediately conjure specific images. We think of the thunderous roar of artillery, the deafening explosions of bombs dropped from B-17 bombers, the rat-a-tat-tat of machine gun fire echoing through trenches. We think of technological advancement, of a war defined by its machinery, its engineering, its brutal efficiency. We think of the Tiger tanks that terrorized Allied forces, the Spitfires that defended British skies, the atomic bombs that ended the war in a blinding flash. This was modern warfare at its most devastating. Technology versus technology, machine versus machine. But what if I told you that one of the most impactful acts of this entire war came from a source no one expected? What if the weapon that struck the deepest fear into the hearts of Nazi soldiers wasn't a bomb or a bullet, but something far more ancient? Something that whispered death instead of announcing it? This is the story of silent revenge. Not the revenge that comes with armies and invasions. Not the revenge that makes headlines and wins medals. This is the revenge that happens in the shadows, in the quiet moments between battles, in the spaces where conventional warfare cannot reach. This is about one individual who looked at the war differently, who saw an opportunity where others saw only limitations, and who turned an ancient weapon into a modern nightmare for the enemy. His story has been buried beneath decades of official histories and grand narratives about famous battles and celebrated generals. But his contribution was real. His impact was measurable, and his methods were unlike anything the enemy had ever encountered. The German occupation forces in certain territories during World War II had grown comfortable with their understanding of warfare. They knew how to defend against rifle fire. They had protocols for artillery bombardments. They could spot aircraft and sound alarms. They had become experts at modern combat, trained to respond to the weapons of their time. But there was one thing they never prepared for, one weapon they never considered. And that oversight would cost them dearly. Because while they were looking for the roar of engines and the flash of gunpowder, death was coming for them in complete silence, launched from a weapon their ancestors might have recognized, but they had long forgotten. In a world that was racing toward technological supremacy, where every nation poured resources into developing faster planes, bigger bombs, and more efficient killing machines, choosing to use a crossbow seems almost absurd. It seems primitive, backwards, like bringing a knife to a gunfight, except even more extreme. Why would anyone, in the middle of the most technologically advanced war in human history, choose to rely on a weapon that was already outdated in the medieval period? The answer isn't simple, and it isn't obvious, but it reveals something profound about warfare that we often forget. Sometimes being smarter beats being stronger. Sometimes being quiet beats being loud. And sometimes the oldest solutions are exactly what a modern problem needs. Let's understand the strategic context first. World War II wasn't just fought on open battlefields. Much of the war, especially in occupied territories, was fought in cities, in towns, in the spaces between the front lines where resistance movements operated. These weren't places where you could roll in with tanks or call in airstrikes without massive civilian casualties. These were places where you needed precision, where you needed to move unseen, where you needed to strike and disappear before the enemy even knew what happened. And this is where the crossbow became not just useful, but perfect. Think about the advantages. First, and most obviously, silence. A rifle shot echoes for miles. It alerts every enemy in the area. It brings soldiers running. It ends your mission before it's even complete. But a crossbow? It makes almost no sound. Just the soft thwick of the string releasing and the bolt cutting through air. By the time anyone realizes something has happened, you're already gone. The target is down, and there's no indication of where the attack came from. No muzzle flash to pinpoint your location, no gunshot to triangulate your position, just silence and a body. Second, precision. A well-made crossbow in the hands of someone who knows how to use it is devastatingly accurate at short to medium range. We're talking about the ability to hit a target the size of a human head from 50 meters away, from 100 meters in the right conditions. And unlike a rifle, which requires steady breathing and precise trigger control, a crossbow can be held at ready, fully loaded and aimed, for extended periods without fatigue. You can wait, you can be patient, you can take your time to ensure the shot is perfect. There's no hurry, no need to worry about your arm getting tired or your breathing affecting your aim. When the moment comes, you simply release. Third, and perhaps most psychologically devastating, the sheer terror of the unknown. Imagine being a German soldier in occupied France or Poland. You're stationed at a checkpoint. It's a quiet night. Suddenly, the soldier next to you makes a strange gurgling sound and collapses. You look down and see a bolt, an actual medieval-looking bolt, sticking out of his chest. What do you do? Where do you shoot? How do you defend against an enemy you can't see, can't hear, and who uses a weapon that shouldn't even exist in this war? The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Soldiers can train for gunfights, they can prepare for ambushes with grenades and rifles, but how do you prepare for a ghost with a crossbow? You can't, and that uncertainty, that fear of an enemy who operates outside all the normal rules of warfare, that eats at morale faster than any battle. But let me be absolutely clear about something. This wasn't about being primitive. This wasn't some romantic notion of returning to simpler times or rejecting modernity. This was about being smarter. This was about understanding that in warfare, the best weapon isn't always the most advanced one. The best weapon is the one that gives you an advantage your enemy doesn't expect and can't counter. The crossbow wasn't chosen because it was old. It was chosen because in specific situations, for specific missions, it was better than anything else available. It was about being quieter, being more precise, and ultimately being deadlier in the situations where those qualities mattered most. This was ingenuity, not nostalgia. This was tactical brilliance disguised in medieval clothing. Now let's talk about the man himself. Who was this individual who looked at World War II and decided that what it really needed was a weapon from the 12th century? His identity has been obscured by time and the nature of his work. Resistance fighters and unconventional soldiers rarely kept detailed records. Their effectiveness depended on anonymity. But what we know paints a picture of someone extraordinary. He wasn't a career soldier. He didn't come from a military family or graduate from a prestigious academy. He was, by most accounts, an ordinary person who found himself in extraordinary circumstances. Someone who had lived in one of the occupied territories, who had watched as Nazi forces rolled into his hometown, who had seen friends and family disappear into the night, taken by soldiers who faced no consequences for their brutality. His background suggests someone with practical skills, perhaps a craftsman or tradesman, someone who understood tools and mechanics, someone who could work with their hands and solve problems creatively. The kind of person who, when faced with a challenge, doesn't ask for permission or wait for someone else to fix it, they figure it out themselves. And when the occupation began, when the choice became to either submit or resist, he chose resistance. But he didn't choose it in the way most people did. He didn't join a formal resistance cell initially. He didn't take up a rifle and join the partisans in the forest. He looked at his skills, his resources, and his situation, and he asked himself a different question. How could he hurt the enemy most effectively with what he had? That's when the crossbow entered the picture. It's possible he had experience with archery before the war. Many people in rural areas still hunted with bows. Or perhaps he discovered it through necessity, finding or building a crossbow because ammunition for firearms was scarce and every bullet was precious. Whatever the origin, he quickly realized he had discovered something valuable, something the resistance could use. Because while rifles were powerful, they were also loud and attracted attention. The resistance needed weapons that could strike without revealing their positions. They needed ways to eliminate Nazi officers and collaborators without bringing down the full force of the German military on civilian populations. And that's exactly what the crossbow could do. But here's what makes this story truly compelling. This wasn't just about tactics or strategy. This was personal. The motivation behind his actions, the fuel that drove him to take such risks night after night, came from a place of deep personal loss and burning desire for revenge. Not revenge in some abstract nationalistic sense, not the kind of revenge that comes from reading about atrocities in a newspaper. This was the kind of revenge that comes from witnessing horror firsthand, from losing people you love, from watching your world burn and knowing exactly who lit the match. The details of his personal tragedy vary depending on which fragmented accounts you piece together, but the core truth remains consistent. The Nazis took something from him. Maybe it was his family, killed in a reprisal for resistance activity in his area. Maybe it was his home, destroyed when the Germans cleared a section of his town to create a security zone. Maybe it was his friends, rounded up and shipped off to labor camps or worse. Or maybe it was all of these things, accumulated over months or years of occupation, each loss adding to a growing weight of grief and rage that needed an outlet. And unlike many who were crushed by that weight, he channeled it. He transformed his pain into purpose, his grief into action, his rage into precision. What sets him apart isn't just that he wanted revenge. Many people wanted revenge against the Nazis. What makes his story remarkable is how he pursued it. He didn't lash out blindly. He didn't throw his life away in a futile gesture of defiance. He was methodical, patient, disciplined. He understood that revenge is a dish best served cold, and he was willing to wait for exactly the right moment, the right target, the right conditions. He studied his enemies, learned their patterns, identified their weaknesses, and then, when the time was right, he struck with absolute precision. There's something deeply human about this kind of determination. We can all understand the desire for revenge when we've been wronged, but most of us never act on it, either because we lack the courage or because society restrains us. But in occupied territory during World War II, normal societal rules had collapsed. There was no police to call, no justice system to rely on. There was only the brutal law of the occupier and the desperate resistance of the occupied. In that environment, personal revenge and strategic resistance became the same thing. Every Nazi officer he killed was both an act of personal vengeance and a contribution to the larger war effort. Every target eliminated was both justice for his losses and a blow against the enemy. His personal motivation and his strategic value were inseparable, and that fusion of personal and political made him extraordinarily effective. And there's something else important to understand about his character. This wasn't someone who enjoyed killing. This wasn't a psychopath who used the war as an excuse to indulge violent impulses. By all accounts, he was a reluctant warrior, someone who was forced into violence by circumstances but who never lost sight of his humanity. He didn't kill indiscriminately. He chose his targets carefully. German officers who were known for brutality, Gestapo agents who tortured resistance members, collaborators who had betrayed their neighbors to the Nazis. His revenge was focused and purposeful, not random violence. And that moral clarity, that sense that he was fighting for something larger than himself, even as he pursued personal vengeance, that's what prevented him from becoming the monster he was fighting against. The internal struggle this must have created cannot be ignored. Every time he loaded that crossbow and set out into the night, he was making a choice that could get him killed, a choice that could bring retaliation down on innocent people if he was caught, a choice that required him to take a human life, something that leaves scars on the soul even when that life belongs to an enemy. The quiet determination required to do this night after night, to live with the weight of these decisions, to keep going when every instinct might tell you to hide, to survive, to protect yourself first. That takes a special kind of courage. Not the courage that comes in a moment of adrenaline on a battlefield. The courage that comes in the quiet moments alone, when you have to look at yourself in the mirror and decide who you want to be. So let's talk about how he actually used this weapon. What did his missions look like? How did silent revenge manifest in practical terms? The crossbow became his tool for a very specific type of warfare. He wasn't storming bunkers or ambushing convoys. He was conducting what we would today call targeted eliminations, surgical strikes against high-value targets. And he was doing it in ways that maximized both the physical impact of removing enemy personnel and the psychological impact of creating fear and uncertainty. One of his primary tactics involved operating in urban environments. Towns and cities under occupation were full of German military personnel, but they were also full of civilians. This created a complex environment where the Nazis couldn't just shoot at every shadow or suspected threat without killing their own collaborators or the population they were trying to control. He exploited this. He would identify a target, usually an officer or official, and study their routines, where they went, what routes they took, when they were most vulnerable. Then he would position himself along that route, often on a rooftop or in an upper floor window, and wait, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, waiting for the perfect moment when his target was isolated enough for a shot, but public enough that the body would be found quickly. Because he wanted the body found. He wanted the Germans to know one of their own had been killed. He wanted them to see that bolt and realize they were being hunted by someone they couldn't find or stop.
Another tactic involved sabotage operations. Resistance cells would plan missions to destroy German equipment or supplies, but these missions were risky. Sentries guarded supply depots. Patrols monitored strategic locations. Going in with guns blazing would alert the entire garrison. But a single silent bolt taking out a sentry, that created an opening. That gave the sabotage team the seconds or minutes they needed to complete their mission and escape. He became the point man for these operations, the one who cleared the way by eliminating threats without raising an alarm. His crossbow transformed dangerous missions into manageable ones, and his precision saved countless resistance lives by preventing firefights that would have ended in capture or death. Intelligence gathering was another area where his skills proved invaluable. The resistance needed information about German troop movements, supply lines, and strategic plans. Getting this information often meant getting close to German command posts or following officers to meetings. But getting close meant risking detection, and detection meant death. He provided security for intelligence operatives, covering them from concealed positions. If a patrol got too close, if an officer started to notice something suspicious, he would intervene, silently, precisely, buying time for the operative to escape or complete their mission. His crossbow became a tool not just for killing, but for enabling the broader resistance effort to function more effectively. Then there were the psychological operations, though he probably didn't think of them in those terms. Every unexplained death, every officer found with a bolt through their chest, created ripples of fear through the German ranks. They started seeing threats everywhere. They became paranoid, suspicious of every shadow and every rooftop. They increased security, which meant pulling soldiers away from other duties. They implemented curfews and restrictions which turned the civilian population even more against them. They investigated endlessly, trying to find the person or people responsible, wasting resources and manpower on a hunt for a ghost. In modern military terminology, we'd call this asymmetric warfare, one person with an unconventional weapon creating a disproportionate impact on enemy operations, and it was working. There's a specific account, though details are fragmentary, of a mission that exemplifies his approach perfectly. A Gestapo officer had arrived in his town, known for his brutal interrogation methods and his success at infiltrating resistance cells. This officer had already been responsible for the capture and execution of several resistance members, and word was he was getting close to identifying the leadership of the local cell. He had to be stopped. But he was careful, always surrounded by guards, always varying his routes, always alert. A direct attack would be suicide. But our crossbowman was patient. He watched, he waited, and he noticed something. Every evening, the officer would step out onto the balcony of his commandeered quarters to smoke a cigarette, just for a few minutes, alone. That was the opening. One night, from a building across the square, at a distance most wouldn't even attempt with a crossbow, he took the shot. The officer was found minutes later by his own guards, a bolt buried in his throat, dead before he hit the ground. The investigation never found the shooter. The resistance cell survived, and the Germans learned that even their most careful officers weren't safe. These silent strikes accumulated into something larger than their individual impact. Yes, removing specific officers and officials weakened German control. Yes, providing security for other resistance operations saved lives and enabled missions. But the real power of what he was doing was the cumulative psychological effect. The Germans in his area began to understand that they were in a hostile environment where death could come at any moment from an enemy they couldn't identify or predict. This wasn't a battlefront where you could see the enemy and shoot back. This was an invisible war where their superior technology and training meant nothing against an opponent who refused to fight by their rules. And that realization was terrifying. It degraded morale, it made soldiers request transfers, it made officers paranoid and hesitant. And all of this happened because one person with a crossbow had decided that silence was more powerful than noise, that patience was more deadly than aggression, and that an ancient weapon could be more effective than a modern rifle when used with intelligence and purpose. The ripple effects extended beyond just the immediate area where he operated. Stories spread. Other resistance cells heard about the crossbowman and his methods. Some tried to replicate his success, with varying degrees of effectiveness. The concept of using silent, unconventional weapons became part of the resistance toolkit in ways it hadn't been before. And even more broadly, the German military had to adjust their thinking. They had to consider threats they'd previously dismissed as irrelevant. They had to train soldiers to watch for dangers that weren't part of the standard combat manual. They had to allocate resources to counter a tactic that barely existed anywhere else. One person's unconventional approach created problems for an entire occupying force, and that's the definition of strategic impact.
What makes this even more remarkable is that he was never fighting in what we'd traditionally call a battle. There were no medals awarded for his actions, no official recognition, no place in the history books that chronicle famous engagements and decisive victories. But his contribution to the war effort in his region was immense. How many resistance operations succeeded because he eliminated a threat? How many lives were saved because a brutal German officer was removed before they could do more damage? How many German resources were wasted hunting for him instead of fighting against conventional forces? These questions don't have precise answers, but the impact was real and measurable to those who lived through it. And here's something crucial to understand. While the crossbow wasn't a weapon you'd use to win battles in the traditional sense, it was perfect for winning the kind of war that resistance movements had to fight. The goal wasn't to defeat the German army in open combat. That was impossible. The goal was to make occupation as costly and difficult as possible, to drain resources, to create constant pressure, to ensure that the Germans never felt safe or secure, to make every day of occupation harder than the last. And judged by those criteria, the crossbowman's silent revenge was extraordinarily successful. He wasn't trying to change the course of the war single-handedly. He was trying to make the Germans pay a price for occupying his home, and he succeeded beyond what anyone might have expected from one person with one ancient weapon. There's also something poetic about the choice of weapon that shouldn't be overlooked. The crossbow represents a connection to history, to a time before industrial warfare, before the machinery of death became so efficient and impersonal. There's an intimacy to crossbow combat that doesn't exist with a rifle. You have to be close enough to see your target as a person. You have to commit to each shot in a way that's different from squeezing a trigger. And maybe that was part of the point. Maybe part of his revenge was ensuring that it was personal, that the Germans he killed died knowing, in that last moment, that someone had chosen them specifically, that their death wasn't random collateral damage in some grand strategic bombing, but a deliberate act by someone who had reasons, who had grievances, who was settling a score. There's a humanity to that, even in its violence, a recognition that warfare, at its core, is about people and choices, not just machines and strategies. So why has this story remained largely untold? Why don't we learn about the crossbowmen in history classes alongside stories of famous battles and celebrated generals? Part of it is simply the nature of resistance warfare. Much of what happened in occupied territories was never officially documented. People who did this kind of work couldn't keep records or file reports. Secrecy was survival. And after the war, when the stories were finally told, the focus went to the big names and the big events, the D-Day landings, the Battle of Stalingrad, the fall of Berlin. The individual stories of resistance fighters, especially those who used unconventional methods, often got lost in the larger narrative. They became footnotes if they were mentioned at all, or they were absorbed into general stories about resistance movements without the specific details that made them unique. There's also a tendency in historical narratives to focus on technology and progress. We like to tell stories about how superior technology won the war, about how Allied innovation and industrial capacity overwhelmed the Axis powers. A story about someone succeeding with an ancient weapon doesn't fit that narrative. It complicates the clean storyline about modern warfare and technological supremacy. It suggests that maybe there are other factors, other approaches, other ways of thinking about conflict that are just as important as having the biggest guns or the fastest planes. And that's a more complex story to tell, one that requires us to think differently about what makes someone effective in warfare. But there's a deeper reason these stories matter, and why they deserve to be remembered. Because conventional military history, the history of famous generals and decisive battles, tells us only part of the truth about war. It tells us about the big movements, the strategic decisions, the clash of armies. But it often misses the individual stories, the personal acts of courage and creativity, the ways that ordinary people found to resist and fight back when they had every reason to give up. The crossbowman story is important not because it changed the outcome of World War II in some grand strategic sense. It's important because it shows us something about human resilience and ingenuity. It shows us that when people are pushed to their limits, when they lose everything, when they're facing an enemy that seems invincible, they can still find ways to fight back. They can still make a difference. They can still exact their revenge and make the powerful fear them. And in today's world, where we often feel powerless against large systems and overwhelming forces, there's something inspiring about that. The crossbowman didn't have an army. He didn't have advanced technology or massive resources. He had a weapon that was already outdated centuries before he was born, his own intelligence, and an unshakable determination to make his enemies pay for what they'd done. And with just those things, he became a legend in his region, a nightmare for the occupiers, and a symbol of resistance that still resonates today if we take the time to listen to his story.
This is why we need to remember stories like his, not just to honor the past, though that's important, but to remind ourselves of what individuals are capable of when they refuse to accept defeat, when they look at their circumstances and their resources and find creative solutions instead of making excuses, when they take risks not because they're reckless, but because they've decided some things are worth risking everything for. The crossbowman could have hidden, could have kept his head down and survived by collaborating or staying silent. Many people did, and we don't judge them for it, because survival under occupation is its own kind of courage. But he chose differently. He chose to fight with what he had, in the way he could, accepting the risks because the alternative, living under Nazi rule without resisting, was worse than any danger he might face. There's a contemporary relevance to this story that goes beyond just historical interest. We live in an age of rapid technological change, where we're constantly told that the newest, most advanced, most expensive solution is always the best one. We're taught to believe that innovation means moving forward, adopting the latest tools and methods, leaving behind anything that seems old or outdated. But the crossbowman story teaches us something different. It teaches us that sometimes the best solution to a problem isn't the most advanced one. Sometimes it's about understanding the fundamentals of what you're trying to accomplish and finding the tool that best serves that purpose, regardless of how old or new it might be. It's about adaptability and creative thinking rather than just following the conventional wisdom about what you're supposed to do. This applies to more than just warfare. In business, in technology, in personal challenges, we often overcomplicate things. We look for sophisticated solutions when sometimes a simple approach would work better. We invest in expensive tools when we haven't fully utilized what we already have. We follow trends and adopt popular methods without stopping to ask whether they're actually right for our specific situation. The crossbowman succeeded not because he had access to cutting-edge technology, but because he understood his environment, understood his enemy, and chose a tool that gave him specific advantages that mattered in his context.
That kind of strategic thinking, that ability to step back and really analyze a situation rather than just reaching for the obvious solution, that's as valuable today as it was in World War II. There's also something here about the power of individuals to make a difference. We often feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problems we face, whether they're political, environmental, social, or personal. We think that one person can't possibly matter against such massive forces. But history is full of examples, like this one, of individuals who had an outsized impact precisely because they refused to accept that premise. They didn't wait for someone else to solve the problem. They didn't use the scale of the challenge as an excuse for inaction. They looked at what they could do with the resources they had in the position they were in, and they did it. And often, those individual actions inspired others, created ripples that spread far beyond the original act. The Crossbowman wasn't trying to win World War II by himself. He wasn't under the illusion that his actions alone would defeat Nazi Germany. But he was determined to make his contribution, to do his part, to ensure that the enemy paid a price in his area for the occupation. And in doing that, he created an impact that lasted far beyond his individual kills or missions. He inspired other resistance members. He created tactical problems for the Germans that consumed their resources. He demonstrated that unconventional thinking could be just as powerful as conventional military might. One person making a choice, taking action, refusing to give up. That's how change happens. That's how resistance works. Not through grand gestures or single decisive battles, but through accumulated acts of courage and creativity by individuals who decide that doing something is better than doing nothing. As we close this story, we need to talk about legacy and memory. The Crossbowman, whoever he was, probably never expected to be remembered. He likely assumed his actions would remain anonymous, buried in the chaos of war, known only to the few people he worked with directly. And for decades, that was true. His story was whispered in local communities, but never made it into the official histories. He became a legend in his region, but remained unknown to the wider world. But legends have a way of persisting. Stories that resonate with something true about human nature find ways to survive even when they're not officially documented. And now, when we look back at World War II and try to understand not just the big events, but the lived experience of people under occupation, stories like his become important again. We're at a point in history where the last generation of people who lived through World War II is leaving us. Soon, there will be no one left who remembers these events firsthand. No one who can tell us the stories that weren't written down, the legends that were passed along orally, the truths that exist in the spaces between official records. That makes it more important than ever to preserve these narratives while we still can, to seek out the untold stories and give them the attention they deserve, to recognize that history isn't just about what's in the textbooks, but about the countless individual experiences that made up the reality of those times. The Crossbowman's story is one of silent revenge, but it's also a story about adaptability, ingenuity, courage, and the refusal to accept defeat even when the odds seem impossible. It's a story that challenges our assumptions about what makes someone effective or heroic. It reminds us that sometimes the most impactful stories are indeed the quiet ones, the ones that happen in shadows and silence, the ones that don't make headlines but change lives nonetheless. It's a story that asks us to think differently about warfare, about resistance, about what individuals are capable of when circumstances demand everything they have. Sometimes the most impactful stories are the ones whispered by history, waiting for us to truly listen. The Crossbowman's tale is one of those whispers, a voice from the past telling us that there are always ways to fight back, always opportunities to resist, always options beyond the obvious ones, telling us that ancient solutions can solve modern problems if we're creative enough to see the possibilities, telling us that one person with determination and ingenuity can shake an empire, even if that empire has all the advanced weapons and overwhelming force in the world. This is the legacy of WW2's Silent Avenger, not measured in medals or monuments, but in the inspiration his story provides to anyone who feels powerless against overwhelming odds. He proved that silence can be louder than any roar, that patience can be more deadly than aggression, that a single arrow, launched at the right moment at the right target, can echo through history louder than 1,000 artillery shells. His revenge wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, methodical, precise, and it was absolutely devastating. That's the power of the untold story. That's the legacy of the Crossbowman. And that's why his tale, whispered through the decades, finally deserves to be heard.